Hi there, I'm Craig Wilson, and I'm excited to present my defense presentation on my problem of practice on the impact of andragogy on increasing the effectiveness of professional development for teachers. It is a quantitative study. Don't worry, I am going to explain what andragogy is here shortly. Getting into my agenda, I'm going to present a problem statement followed by the literature review, the theoretical framework I used, my purpose statement, the methodology, then get to the fun stuff to show you my results, my implications and recommendations, and finally how I'm going to distribute my findings. My problem statement is as following. Professional development for classroom teachers fails to make a significant change in instructional practice or student achievement. The research I have found says that we spend in large districts up to $18,000 per teacher per year, which equates to about $8 billion in the US. 19 of those contract days, or about 10%, are spent in professional development, yet only about 30% of teachers improve on their evaluations, and worse yet, of the teachers who leave the profession on their exit interviews, 80% of them said when they were quitting that they found their content area to be their PD to be ineffective. I also thought anecdotally the PD was ineffective and it didn't meet the needs of the adults, but I wanted to test this theory, which is why I created this problem of practice. So my literature review actually is in two different sections. One is on professional development, both why it's ineffective and the characteristics of effective PD. Then I also wanted to study the adult learning theories. I looked into self-directed learning, transformative learning, and for my problem of practice, I chose andragogy. So andragogy is known as the art and science of teaching adults. It's different than pedagogy, which you've probably heard of before, which is the art and science of teaching children. The literature told me the following things about adult learning: that the needs and the interests are different than children. They're physiologically and neurologically different than children. Adults want to have control and make decisions over what they learn. They're responsible for constructing their new meaning. They are impacted by critical events that cause reflection, action, and a change in their self-concept. They need to know the reason why they're learning. They desire for their knowledge to be practical and for them to immediately apply it. And they are more intrinsically motivated. Moving into the next section on the characteristics of effective PD, it's well designed, planned with intended outcomes. It uses collective decision making and the PD needs, processes, and outcomes of the learners. It's appropriate to that teacher's content area needs. That was one of the biggest things that I've discovered about effective PD. It considers the teacher's experience and their readiness to learn. It's active and engaging. It's collaborative and reflective. It does provide follow-up and follow-through. And usually there's some support for the learners as they're going through their change. My theoretical framework is andragogy as proposed by Malcolm Knowles and his associates. It is both a theoretical framework and a conceptual framework for instructional design. So over on the left, you see the theoretical framework. So there are certain assumptions of the needs and interests of adults. They need to know why they're learning. They have self-concepts. They need to have their prior experiences, met. They need to have or be on a readiness level to learn. They're oriented towards learning, which means they want it to be applicable and immediately practical, and they're intrinsically motivated. So what Knowles and his associates did was they moved that theory into an instructional design, a conceptual framework. These are the 8 design elements. Prepare the learner, create a conducive climate, mutually plan with the learner, diagnose the needs, set those learning objectives, create lesson plans that have active and engaging activities, and finally allow the learner to reflect and evaluate. And this leads me into my purpose statement. So this quantitative study aims to test the effectiveness of including andragogical principles and design elements in professional development. Remember, I'm trying to test to see if traditional PD, which is set for pedagogy, is less impactful or effective than andragogy, which is set up for adults. My methodology is as follows. I came up with my research questions and which design best fit my hypotheses. I selected my site and the participants, collected that data, analyzed it, and then looked at my limitations and delimitations. So here are my research questions. There's 6 of them, but they're not as daunting as they look. The top ones, the 3 in red, were for both the control and the treatment group. So, and they all are basically the same thing. I wanted to see if there was a perception of difference between the control group and the treatment group. The control group having traditional professional development, sit and get cafeteria style, lecture style, versus the treatment group, which was using those adult learning theories and an instructional design. So the first question asked about, is there a difference in the perception between the two groups with the principles, which are the needs and interests. The second question asks if there was a difference in the way they perceived the design elements or how the instruction was designed. And the third one was combining both of them to see what was the overall outcome. My next 3 questions took just the treatment group, and I wanted to dig a little bit deeper. So my fourth question was, are there certain ones of those 8 design elements that could predict and be used to enhance and improve professional development? My fifth and sixth questions were very similar. What they were doing was taking different bands of age groups or different bands of teaching experience and seeing if there was a difference in the learner in the way they perceived andragogy in their professional development. So again, my design is the following. So I came up with those research questions and I determined the best way to test that, which for me was through a quasi-experimental research design study. My tests are all going to be parametric, which you'll see here in a few minutes. I selected my site and participants. I did my experiments, collected my data, analyzed it, looked at the results, and came up with my discussion and my implications. So who and where did I do the testing? Well, I chose a local school district in Central Texas because it represented the state in general. So it was a nice representation. It was a convenient sampling because I was the director in that district, and there happened to have been a nice professional development convention that we were going to have over the summer. So in that professional development conference, there were 6 basically 1 hour long sessions, of which there were 5 to 6 courses in each section. We sprinkled in the treatments or the andragogy courses throughout, so that there were 30 traditional courses and 18 andragogical courses. The participants themselves there was about 120 classroom teachers ranging from pre-kindergarten through 12th grade, and they represented all the different content areas. When it came time to collect the data, I used an instrument called the Andragogy in Practice Inventory, or API. It had 60 Likert style questions that were asking, from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And it also had 6 demographic questions. The 60 Likert questions were asking questions around both those adult principles or what their needs and interests were, and about the way the instruction was designed. They completed it online through a Qualtrics survey. I downloaded that survey and then I brought it into IBM SPSS to do the analysis. And while I was there, I coded it by both control group and treatment group so that I could get my results. So looking at the way I analyzed that data, so the first 3 questions, again, I was comparing the control group and the treatment group for both the andragogical principles and those design elements, and then I was comparing both of them together. For that, I used an independent samples t-test. That was the best parametric test for that. And again, you can see that was for both groups. Then for that 4th question, I was trying to predict which design elements could impact PD the best. For that, I used a multiple linear regression. And then the treatment group, again, I was looking at a preference between age bands and teacher bands. And for that, the best tool to use was an analysis of variance or an ANOVA. Certain limitations came through this research study. It is a quasi-experimental design. I did not do a pre-test. I just had the post-test to do. And so it could impact the generalizability. I was an instructor for many of those courses, and so that could have introduced bias into it as well. The participants also could have been biased because they were self-reporting. The site selection and the sampling, again, was for convenience. And in some of my parametric tests, I didn't completely cleanly meet all of those assumptions. However, my delimiters were the following. This was designed based on the scope, the time, and the ability to get my participants, and that was an intentional choice. I also chose andragogy over the other 2 adult learning theories. And there were some factors in there that I wanted to check for demographics, things that you could account for when you did professional development. And now the fun stuff. Here are the results. So for my first question, when I was looking at just those adult needs and interests, and you can see here in the dark red is the treatment group, and the control group is in the orange. And what you're going to notice is for each one of those assumptions or needs and interests of the adults, the treatment group had a preference over the control group. This goes along with my literature review. Knowles, obviously, this is his andragogical study, but also Tao and both Hamstra and Brockett both studied self-directed learning, and they said that this would be the case, that teachers want to be self-directed and they want to control their learning. Garrison put another spin on that as well when he talked about self-management, self-monitoring, and motivation. And again, you can see that presented in each one of those elements. And then when you look at the overall column on the right-hand side, same thing. Research question number 2 looked at the instructional design elements. And again, the treatment group perceived, or they found it more impactful than the control group having those intentionally set within their training. So this goes along with the characteristics of effective professional development, that it's planned well, is connected to intended outcomes and evaluation, focuses on that content area, it's immediately applicable, it's engaging, collaborative. And what's interesting is if you look at the one on evaluation, that really hits into Jack Mesereau's transformative learning when he talks about the ability to be able to critically reflect. And that was one of the indicators that presented most strongly in this question. Question number 3 is just looking at the combined totals. And again, you can see that across the board, the treatment group had a preference for andragogy over the control group. Question 4, remember, I wanted to look to see which one of those 8 design elements could predict better professional development. And what I discovered here was that there were 4 that were statistically significant. Evaluating the learning, was the highest, followed by preparing the learner, and then planning the learning and planning the learning activities both came in as statistically significant as well. So if nothing else, the results indicate that if you consider those 4 factors, your professional development could be better. Looking at the way the age bands played out, so remember, the higher the mean score, the more perceived impact that PD had, and this is the treatment group only. And this goes along with the research because both Howell and Roterman and Richter all have said in the research that adults are most active in their early years, and it starts to tail off as they get older. And you can see those in the mean scores. Similar results as you would expect when you get more experience. You're also older, and you can see that the same thing, the mean score lowered as teachers became more experienced, which also was shown in the research that says that they become less collaborative, less willing to observe others, and less likely to do research. So what implications can you make from this? Well, andragogy is critical for effective PD for all ages and all experience levels. Engaged learners are more likely to become self-directed and reflective, and more likely to implement that new learning. Also, instructional designers and presenters should become more familiar with andragogy and embed it into their practice. I recommend that key decision makers must insist that andragogical PD it's both internal and external, that PD should become andragogical. Teachers must advocate for their self-improvement, and they have to become part of the PD process at the instructional design level. Other recommendations are we need to train instructional designers and coaches and presenters in andragogy, and we need to tailor PD based on the audience's age, experience, and content area. I plan to distribute this information in a few ways. One, I want to present it to my senior leadership team at a high level with a slide deck, recordings, handouts, and infographics. I also want to present this to the curriculum directors and instructional coaches, but get it at a deeper level where they can teach from it. I want to present it at district and state conferences such as the Texas Association of School Administrators. And finally, I do want to publish in some peer-reviewed academic journals. These are lists of some of my selected references, And I would truly like to thank my advisors, Dr. LaConta Sanguris, Dr. Smith at the Writing Center, Cece Lively, the Student Success Team, and my peer writer group. Couldn't have done it without all of y'all. Thank you so much for listening.